Okay, so not that I'm old or anything, but in my lifetime, things in America have gotten a lot more tense. When I was growing up, it was pretty common to treat political affiliation more like sports fandom, i.e., I could be a Bears fan and still be friends with a Packers fan, even if I hated their team. But today, it feels more like I'm a Bears fan and Dad is a Packers fan, so I will not be coming to Thanksgiving dinner this year. Indeed, it's become something of a cliche to say that America is more politically polarized than ever before. But it feels true. According to USC Annenberg's new Polarization Index, which measures political polarization on a scale from 1 to 100, America has a whopping 82.5 in 2021. A team of researchers writing in Politico in 2020 noted that 33% of Democrats and 36% of Republicans feel it would be at least a little bit justified in using violence to achieve their political goals. That was an increase of 9% for both parties in 2017. In this climate, it's maybe no wonder that polls indicate that somewhere between 43 and 50% of Americans have said civil war feels imminent in the next decade or several years, respectively. But you're probably thinking, people say crazy things in surveys all the time.
Give me something drastic a man might do to get out of marrying his girlfriend.
He gonna flirt with her mama.
Yeah! But is there actually any merit to these fears? Let's find out in this Wisecrack Edition. Could America have another civil war? The term civil war originated in ancient Rome around the 1st century BCE, according to historian David Armitage. He writes, the Romans were not the first to suffer internal conflict, but they were the first to experience it as civil war. Romans were no strangers to violence and war, but violence was never inflicted on its own citizens by its own citizens. For them, it was very important that wars engaged in by the state be rationalizable as just. In that case, how could a war in which the state was on both sides of the argument possibly be considered just? It couldn't. Which is why ancient Roman commentator Lucan called civil wars wars which would bring no triumphs. Arguably, the first civil war started when a high-ranked Roman politician with a grudge named Sulla marched his troops through the city. Interestingly, this seems to have occurred on impulse. Armitage says the consul seems to have had no plans to march, but his loyal soldiers urged him on. What marked this as the first civil war is that the soldiers treated Rome like any outside territory they were trying to conquer, and employed all the formal signs of war, like trumpets and flags. Nobody in the Senate knew how to respond to this invasion. Nothing like this had ever happened before. Sulla was victorious and assumed a role as dictator of Rome. His enemies sought vengeance, and a second civil war ensued just a few years later. As Armitage explains, Sulla had not intended anything remotely resembling a military takeover of the Republic. And yet this act had marked the beginning of a cycle of civil violence, one that would not end until the creation of the empire with the elevation of Augustus as emperor in 27 BCE. As Armitage notes, the phrase civil war was spoken sparingly, if ever at all, because of the harsh memories of major conflicts. The wars precipitated by Sulla's actions would come to define a huge part of Roman history. Rome's experiences with civil war, as recounted by many of the empire's most famous writers and thinkers, would then go on to influence the Latin West for centuries. Stories of Rome's civil war consumed European intellectuals and artists alike, and according to Armitage, inspired some of the most creative political thinking of well into the Enlightenment. He writes, indeed, for more than a millennium and a half, civil war was viewed through Rome-tinted spectacles. While it's hard to definitively say that Rome's history directly informed early modern European history, this pattern would play out quite similarly as Europe endured endless cycles of violence for centuries. European thinkers contextualized these wars through their understanding of ancient Rome's past, and concluded that, as Armitage puts it, civil war was one of the distinguishing marks of civilization. That is to say, you couldn't have a modern liberal state without the perennial threat of civil war. This was a depressing pill to swallow, and the optimism of the Enlightenment era in Europe, which began in the late 17th century and came to fruition in the 18th, led to some rebranding of civil war by intellectuals. Essentially, they took civil war and repackaged it as revolution. As German historian Reinhard Koselleck argues, theories of revolution emerged as a concept in contrast to that of civil war. Armitage adds that the nascent category of revolution was designed in part to repress memories of civil war and to replace them with something more constructive, more hopeful, and more forward-looking. Where civil war was senseless violence inflicted without hope for anything better, revolution was justifiable violence, enacted with hopes of creating a better world. The murkiness of the distinction between civil war and revolution often plays out in real time. For example, when it took place, many viewed the American Revolution as a British Civil War, or the American Civil War. Not until a year into the war did a South Carolina judge call it the American Revolution, and the language wasn't adopted officially until 1779. Similarly, the American Civil War was for decades called the War of Rebellion in the North, which viewed the South as rebelling against their shared state. In the South, which viewed the conflict as an international one between two independent nations, it was called the War Between the States. Not until 1907 was it officially dubbed a civil war by Congress. Thus, from the very inception of modern revolution, the distinction between rebellion and civil war has been difficult to parse. As Armitage writes, it's easy to perform the conjugation. I am a revolutionary. You are a rebel. They are engaged in a civil war. Today, civil wars have come to define most of the armed conflict in the world. Since 1989, there's been an average of 29 civil wars going on at any given time. That's because after the fall of the Soviet Union, civil wars skyrocketed, reaching their highest numbers in modern history, until 2019, when they peaked again. So it doesn't seem all that surprising that people are worried about impending war in America. As Civil War scholar Barbara Walter explains, if you were an analyst in a foreign country looking at events in America, the same way you'd look at events in Ukraine or the Ivory Coast or Venezuela, you would go down a checklist assessing each of the conditions that make civil war likely. And what you would find is that the United States, a democracy founded more than 2 centuries ago, has entered very dangerous territory. So, why the concern? Well, Walter is a member of the Political Instability Task Force, created by the US government to assess which variables make civil war likely. The task force came up with 38 possible variables, ranging from poverty to corruption to population size, and did predictive modeling to see which factors were most likely to contribute to interstate conflict. And to their surprise, the best predictors were not income equality or poverty. It was what they call the polity score of the nation. A polity score ranks a country on a 21-point scale from autocracy to democracy, with plus 10 being a full democracy and minus 10 being a full autocracy. Countries like Norway, New Zealand, Denmark, and Canada are plus 10. Saudi Arabia is a minus 10. In the middle, scoring between minus 5 and plus 5, is what's known as a anocracy, or a partial democracy. Anocracies include Algeria at a plus 2, and Egypt at a minus 4. Importantly, anocracies are the countries most likely to descend into civil war. As Walter writes, all the things that experts thought should matter in the outbreak of civil war somehow didn't. It wasn't the poorest countries that were at the highest risk of conflict, or the most unequal, or the most ethnically or religiously heterogeneous, or even the most repressive. It was living in a partial democracy that made citizens more likely to pick up a gun and begin to fight. The task force found that anocracies are 2 times more likely to endure political instability or civil war than autocracies, and 3 times more likely than democracies. We might assume that super oppressive autocracies are most likely to spur the mass anger necessary to facilitate a civil war. But since 1870, the world has experienced several waves of massive democratization, which have been closely accompanied by waves of civil wars. Walter concludes that when a nation moves from an autocracy to a democracy, this in-between transition period is when it's at a high risk of enduring civil war. She writes, "A primary reason for revolt is that democratic transitions create new winners and losers. Because the new government in an anocracy is often fragile and the rule of law is still developing, the losers, former elites, opposition leaders, citizens who once enjoyed advantages, are not sure the administration will be fair or that they will be protected. This can create genuine anxieties about the future. This is particularly true if the countries attempt to transition to democracy rapidly, like some of the USSR's former satellite states, as opposed to gradually, like, say, Mexico." But what Walter is really alarmed by isn't autocracies turning into democracies, which have constituted a large percentage of civil wars in recent memory. She notes a more recent phenomenon. An increasing number of democracies are becoming less and less democratic, veering towards autocratic on the polity scale. Such countries range from the UK to Hungary to Russia. Walter writes, democratic countries that veer into anocracy do so not because their leaders are untested and weak, like those who are scrambling to organize in the wake of a dictator, but rather because elected leaders, many of whom are quite popular, start to ignore the guardrails that protect their democracies. So what does all this have to do with America? Well, long a stable +10 democracy, it dropped to a +5 in 2020. The highest score possible for an anocracy, but an official anocracy nonetheless. Though the country surged back to a +8 in 2021, the shift was extremely alarming to Walter. She writes, a country standing on this threshold can easily be pushed toward conflict through a combination of bad governance and increasingly undemocratic measures that further weaken its institutions. But America recovered, so we're in the clear now, right? Well, while our anocracy score did rise back up, there's another reason to be concerned. Because you know what's the second highest factor in determining a country's likelihood of descending into civil war? Factionalism. While Walter notes that early 20th century civil wars were mostly waged over ideology or class, since the mid-20th century, they're often centered around clashing ethnic or religious groups fighting for dominance. As Walter explains, countries that are considered factionalized have identity-based political parties that are often intransigent and inflexible. Boundaries between them are rigid, leading to intense competition and even combat. The groups that are competing are often about the same size. In fact, it's this balance of power between the two groups that creates such fierce rivalry. Fittingly, the Founding Fathers worried that if the project of the United States failed, it would be because of factionalism, which doesn't sound far off. America's two main parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, are sharply divided by many metrics: ethnicity, education level, religious affiliation, and geography, specifically rural versus urban. And for the most part, these parties seem to hate each other. A study by scholars Nathan P. Calmo and Lillian Mason found that 20% of Republicans and 15% of Democrats think the country would be better off if large percentages of the other party straight up died. And this might lead us to assuming that Civil War 2.0 is on the horizon. But civil war in America today would not look like the 19th century. Walter predicts that it would take the form of insurgencies, i.e., revolts against the government, and preparations have been made. America saw the rise of far-right militia groups recruiting members, stockpiling arms, and even traveling abroad to train in the early 1990s. But in recent years, militia activity has skyrocketed. Between 2008 and 2011, the number of militias in America ballooned from 43 to 334. Importantly, insurgencies typically follow three predictable stages, according to the CIA. The first is pre-insurgency, where groups build a common identity centered around grievances. Second comes incipient conflict, where random acts of violence are committed. The final stage is open insurgency, which involves organized attacks ranging from guerrilla warfare to assassinations to bombings of infrastructure like bridges or schools. Walter argues that the January 6th attack on the Capitol was the first act of open insurgency in the United States. She writes, "We are a factionalized anocracy that is quickly approaching the open insurgency stage, which means we are closer to civil war than any of us would like to believe." And as we've seen in the past, this is concerning for a couple of reasons, which we can draw from history. One, insurgents will likely view themselves as revolutionaries. And two, the launching of one civil war can often precipitate unavoidable cycles of future civil wars. And all these tensions are magnified by social media. Walter cites social media's penchant for prioritizing provocative content as having material political effects. We did a whole video about that, so check it out. She notes Myanmar as a prime example, where Facebook promoted content that fanned the flames of a horrific ethnic cleansing, despite persistent warnings from journalists and human rights organizations that this was happening. Walter argues that social media platforms' pursuit of profit serves to promote fascism all over the world, dividing nations, turning violent impulses viral, and eventually making civil war more likely. With the United States having the third biggest population of social media users, this certainly seems like cause for concern. But there's another side to all of this that's equally important. As journalist Fintan O'Toole cautions, predicting future civil wars can actually make those conflicts more likely to occur as it increases paranoia on both sides. So in some ways, predicting a future civil war can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. What's more, it's important to remember, no democracy that has slid into anocracy has experienced a full-on civil war, yet. Walter is simply calling attention to an alarming new phenomenon. Another reason to be skeptical is that the United States Army is, for better or worse, way stronger than it was in the First Civil War, when it was composed of approximately 16,000 members spread across the country. Today, we have 1.3 million soldiers, 900,000 in reserve, and about 450,000 in the National Guard. Absent a military coup, this makes an armed insurrection significantly harder to carry out. Furthermore, America's factions are less concentrated geographically than they were in the 19th century, with even the reddest states containing liberal urban centers. So it's hard to imagine war breaking out between regions. And in short, we're not going to say America is on the brink of civil war, and not just because that makes such a thing more likely. But none of this answers the question, why all the intrastate tensions? Well, philosophers have been thinking about civil war by various names ever since they started considering the structure of society, which means at least as far back as Plato's Republic. Plato got the ball rolling on philosophers being concerned with the question of how to keep a state, empire, or political community in general functioning, and how to avoid violent conflict within a polity. In planning his ideal society, he offered tips on everything from education to child rearing to who should be in charge, which was a philosopher. Unfortunately, he didn't really account for things like natural disasters and foreign invasions, which are both factors that eventually led to the downfall of the Greek polity. Eventually, this ball got to Thomas Hobbes, who thought that what you really need is a king who everyone obeys, even if he sucks, because even the worst government is better than the best civil war. Eventually, Carl Schmitt, a 20th century political theorist and a literal Nazi, jumped into the chat. The state's job for Schmitt is to protect its citizens while creating the conditions for any internal issues to be solved with non-violent political communication, because the opposite, civil war, is the same as the end of the state itself. As scholar Jan Kujawski explains, civil war, as Schmitt puts it, equals the dissolution of the state, as this is the end of a territorially closed organized unity that is not available to political alien entities. Instead of a closed system where shared values enable political exchange, we get all-out conflict. So how does this happen? According to Kujawski, the emergence of civil war might be related to any sort of situation in which a political force would emerge that would gain great popularity, that would be able to guarantee to society more safety than official state authorities. In such a case, the submission of the citizens would be directed at specifically this force and not the weak state that would be unable to provide safety. Put more simply, when the state seems incapable of protecting its citizens, but another force emerges that can, or at least appears to be, then a civil war is born. People side with the new force in the face of what appears to be an increasingly illegitimate state. Conflict ensues. This is concerning, whether or not you think your state is doing a great job of protecting you. At the same time, Plato's dream of a long-term peace, what he called stasis, is just that, a dream that's not viable in a world where we can't control natural disasters and economic turmoil. And the idea of a benevolent monarch has a history of going pretty poorly. So we're left with Schmitt's guidelines to the stakes of and prerequisites for a civil war. A government without legitimacy met by another force that offers a potentially better scenario for at least some of the state's citizens. So the best way that American government can avoid civil war is to attempt to gain back a greater level of legitimacy, which is a tricky feat in such a polarized country. And at the end of the day, it would be silly for us to predict whether civil war will happen, much less how to avoid it, which is maybe not the most satisfying conclusion, but did you really come to a YouTube channel to get exact predictions on the future of American political stability? But what do you all think? Is civil war in America starting to feel inevitable? How can such a conflict be avoided? And why do civil wars seem to be the new mainstay of armed conflict in the world? Please let us know what you think in the comments. Thanks as always to our patrons. Please check out our Patreon page if you haven't before. It is the single best way that you can directly support the channel and the work that we're doing. As always, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you later.